Viridian, The Green Guide, by Clouds. My Head in the Clouds Not Coming Down. Read by Ogawa 5. Chapter 72. Escape. Summary. Have fun. For once, everyone on Ogawa's head was in agreement. If nothing changed soon, they were going to break, and there wouldn't be anything they could do about it. It didn't make it any easier that he couldn't really remember anything more than vague memories from further back than the past year or so, and he was almost positive that Sensei was using some sort of brainwashing quirk based on the multiple times he hadn't even wanted to disobey. After who knew how long since he'd arrived in this nightmare, Ogawa could feel himself becoming more compliant and obeying half the orders the doctor gave him without a second thought. He almost laughed now when he remembered how afraid he had been of the shadows that shared his body now, and how worried he'd been that he would lose himself to them, when really he should have been terrified of all of them losing themselves completely and becoming exactly what the doctor wanted them to be. As it was, even more than Kumo, the shadows were his support during the long hours when the doctor stole him away for a session. Ogawa wouldn't necessarily call them friends, but they had grown closer and he wasn't afraid of them anymore, which was better than nothing. Maybe eventually he'd actually get used to them. Or maybe the doctor would wipe the rest of his memories and he wouldn't ever remember having his head to himself. From the short chats he was able to have with Kumo when both of them were lucid, they'd decided that the shadows must be what was left of the owners of the quirks that the experiments had mixed with theirs. Sensei's quirk seemed to be able to take quirks from one person and give them to another, and Ogawa figured it made sense for the shadows to be there. A person's quirk was such an important part of them that, when it was removed, a little of that person was torn out alongside it. He didn't really want to know what had happened to the rest of his shadows, and everyone in his head seemed to agree that, considering what they'd gone through so far, it was probably better that they didn't ever try to find out. But it explained why his quirk felt like a hand-me-down sweater that was just a few sizes too big. It was like his quirk, but it wasn't entirely his, so it felt weird and was hard to get used to. It didn't help that he couldn't completely explore his limits without showing his cards to his captors. His unknown quirk limits were his only hope if he ever wanted to get out of here. Footsteps and the sound of something dragging echoed down the hall, and it was only a moment before Kumo was tossed roughly into the cell next to him, unconscious with the black vapor of his new quirk fluctuating out of control. They still hadn't figured out what Kumo's new quirk did, but it must be pretty dangerous, considering that they'd start wiping his memories of the experiments. They probably wanted him to be completely compliant before they allowed him to fully use and understand his quirk, but Ogawa thought that between the two of them, Kumo had a better chance of escaping. "Come on then, your turn now," the doctor said, unlocking Ogawa's cell and kicking him lightly in the ribs so he couldn't pretend to be asleep. "And let's see if we can do it without fighting this time, eh?" Ogawa slowly got to his feet and followed a few steps behind the doctor in feigned compliance. It was a new strategy that he'd been using for a few days now, and one that he desperately hoped didn't backfire, but at this point he was willing to try anything, even pretending to be the obedient little puppet they wanted him to be. The doctor hummed happily as they made their way to the lab, and Ogawa was careful not to show too much interest in any of the hallways they passed. He'd burned down some of them for various experiments, and he was sure that some of the others were decoys, but he still noted every single one, just in case. He resisted the overwhelming temptation to run. In these in-between moments, the doctor was carefully looking for any sign of disobedience or rebellion, and he was far too familiar with the doctor's toys to believe that he'd make it more than a few steps. No, he needed to wait for a time when the doctor was distracted, if he expected to actually be able to fight back or escape. "On the table, please," the doctor said. Ogawa quickly laid down on the cold metal table, placing his wrists and ankles in the designated locations. The doctor fastened the retaining strap around his left ankle and was about to do the other when he glanced down and stopped, before frantically patting his chest pocket. "Ah, where did my good pen go? I swear it was just here." He started turning out the pockets of his lab coat, then started searching around the room. Ogawa held his breath. He was almost entirely unbound and the doctor was distracted. Now was his chance. The more timid of his two shadows yelled at him that it was too good to be true, while the bolder one screamed that this was probably the only chance he would ever get. It took less than a second for him to decide that it was worth the risk and stretch one of his tentacles down to unfasten the single strap the doctor had remembered to tighten before he'd got distracted. It felt weird for Ogawa to stretch his tentacles farther than his neck, but the extra elasticity was completely comfortable for his more cautious shadow, so he tried to rely on that feeling instead as he clumsily undid the strap, keeping a close eye on the doctor as he yelled in triumph and held the lost pen above his head. "Found it!" The doctor smiled and came back to the table, just barely missing when Ogawa's tentacles snapped back into place right as he turned around. "Now, where was I? Ah, yes, I was just about to begin, wasn't I?" Everyone in his head tensed in anticipation as the doctor turned around to grab something from his torture table. The doctor had made a mistake. He'd forgotten that he'd never finished strapping his subject down. Ogawa mentally ran through what he needed to do. Take out the doctor, get Kumo, find the exit. He could do this, but he had to get it right, because they weren't going to get another chance. The doctor turned back around, scalpel in hand, and leaned over Ogawa with a smile. "Sorry about the delay. Let's get—" Ah! Ogawa pounced. As quickly as he could, he wrapped tentacles around every one of the doctor's limbs and another over his mouth and nose, clamping his jaw shut so he couldn't scream for help. With a small confident shudder's encouragement, he tightened the tentacle around the doctor's wrist until he was forced to let go of the scalpel, and Ogawa used another tentacle to retrieve it and throw it across the room. He glanced up at the camera in the corner. He needed to get out of here before backup arrived. The doctor let out a muffled scream as a thick black ink oozed from Ogawa's tentacles and started burning where it touched him. They had figured out that the ink he was able to produce now was kind of acid, but he had only ever shown the doctor the weakest concentration of it, even though his more assertive shadow felt confident that they could control the concentration. Thankfully, that instinct had been correct, and, even though Ogawa had no idea how strong the ink he just produced was, it was enough that, when combined with the lack of air as his tentacles choked him, it took less than a minute for the doctor's eyes to roll back in his head as he passed out from the pain. Ogawa tossed him across the room and immediately ran for the door, cursing when he realized it was locked. Instinctively, his tentacles reached towards the doctor and started searching his pockets. Ogawa almost dropped the key as soon as he found it, but after a brief fumble, he was finally able to shove it in the lock, and he sighed in relief as it clicked open. He didn't want to waste time running through the maze, so instead he stretched his tentacles out as far as they could go down every hall, and used them to search for a breeze or any sensation to show that it might lead outside as he ran back toward the holding cells. He heard footsteps running down one of the halls toward him and panicked, running in the opposite direction of the sound, which unfortunately only got him completely lost. Ogawa whined in frustration. He didn't have time to get lost. He needed to find Kumo and get out. He kept running, both of his shadows urging him on and encouraging him to run faster. He felt a patch of cold air on one of his tentacles and immediately followed it. Nothing looked familiar, and he had no idea if his holding cell was close or halfway across the facility at this point, but he could hear yells behind him and realized he couldn't afford to search for it. He followed the breeze as far as it went, then had to stop to avoid running face first into a brick wall. It was a dead end. The breeze was coming from a window near the ceiling, but it was way too small for him to crawl through. Ogawa whirled around, but his stomach sank and he knew he was screwed. If the doctor found him, they would wipe all the memories he had left, and he'd probably be tortured as punishment, but there wasn't anything he could do. There wasn't enough time to backtrack and find another path, and there definitely wasn't any way he was going to be able to find Kumo so they could escape together. Ogawa cut off that train of thought. If Kumo was in a situation, he'd want him to focus on saving himself and leave him behind. He couldn't afford to worry about anyone else right now, not when he was so close and yet so far from tasting freedom. In desperation, he reached out to his confident shadow. How strong do you think we can make that ink? It wasn't words that he felt in return, just a weird feeling of confidence, like they were excited to rise to the challenge, but it was enough to make Ogawa let out a crazed laugh as he spread his tentacles across the wall behind him and the strongest ink he could possibly create oozed from his skin. The sounds of whoever was chasing him got louder, and he caught a brief glance of literal monsters, most likely the doctor's other experiments, turning the final corner before the wall behind him suddenly gave way, and he found himself scraping past the rough edges of the ruined brick as he tumbled out onto the street. The smell of fresh air for the first time in almost a month was enough to make him freeze. He was out! He'd made it! He was finally free! A sharp pain on his calf brutally reminded him not to get ahead of himself. He looked down and screamed when he saw one of the monsters biting him with multiple rows of teeth. He stretched out his tentacles and strangled what he thought was the monster's neck, adding a medium-strong ink and squeezing until the thing finally stopped biting him. Ogawa gave a final kick to the monster's face and scrambled to his feet, not waiting to see if the monster was still awake or even still alive, as he launched himself blindly down the alley and onto the street. He didn't pay any attention to where he was going, only able to process the unconscious urging from both himself and the shadows to run, hide, get as far away from that hellhole as possible. The bite on his leg was starting to burn, and his heart started to race as he realized that monster must have had some kind of venom, and he had no idea what it did. He pushed through the pain, and the weird cloudy feeling that was starting to take over his brain as he kept running, wiping tears from his eyes as he left the lab and his cellmate behind. He pushed himself past his limits, trying to put as much distance as he could between him and that hellhole, as he ran towards the beginnings of the first sunset he'd seen in months. "I'm sorry, Kumo." Ogawa's voice cracked from stress and dehydration as he pushed himself even faster, running to escape both the fading footsteps of his pursuers and his own guilty relief. I'll come back for you. I have to. I won't leave you there. I'll be your hero. I promise." Oh my gosh, that was such a cool chapter. And like the last thing Ogawa said right there, it was so sad. No. But anyways, guys, I hope you all enjoyed chapter 72 of Viridian the Green Guide, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!